One of the observations in the last 10 or 15 years that we've had in the field is that the number of children who have some form of pervasive developmental problem appears to be increasing. And that's indicated both by a real increase in children who have autism, but also a more profound increase in the number of children who have autistic-like symptoms. And while we believe that there is a real increase in children who have autism, and we don't know exactly what that is, we do know that that's independent, that has nothing to do with neglect. On the other hand, there are children who have symptoms and presentations that are very much like autism. And those symptoms are related to neglect. And what we find are that children who are raised in environments that are relationally impoverished, who in the first few years of life when the brain is so rapidly growing do not get sufficient relational attention, who are not held, who are not rocked, who are not comforted in a healthy way, end up with a whole host of relational problems that can manifest later in life. And the whole issue of neglect is one that we've been struggling with in the field for a long time. It oddly enough, if you look at any state's child protective population, the majority of children who are removed from their homes are removed because of some form of neglect. But then if you look at what we do research on, what we know clinically, the studies about neglect and the research in this area is actually much less than the research on other forms of trauma and maltreatment. So it's an area where we're still learning a lot. Part of our work in the last 10 years or so has been focusing on understanding different forms of neglect. And when we talk about neglect, what we mean is the absence of necessary developmental experiences required to express a core potential. And we should be clear about this. Everybody has unexpressed potential in their brain. This population that's watching this video mostly speaks English. We all had the genetic potential to speak Japanese or Spanish or lots of other languages. Most of us had the genetic potential to learn to read music. Most of us have the genetic potential to learn how to play the guitar, but not all of us do that. That doesn't mean we're neglected. When I talk about neglect, I'm talking about absence of core emotional experiences required to build in self-regulation capabilities, the absence of fundamental relational opportunities to build in the capacity to form and maintain a healthy relationship, absence of fundamental cognitive capabilities to build in the fundamentals of speech and language and abstract thinking. And sadly enough, in the population of children that we work with, we can find examples of all of these different kinds of neglect. Some neglect is because there's been an absence of the specific kind of experience at a key time during development. And then some of the neglect is what we call chaotic neglect. It's not because children, for example, aren't hearing words that they don't develop speech and language. It's because the words they hear are chaotic, they're yelling between adults, they're television, they're not spoken to the child, but they're sounds all over the place. But there's insufficient opportunity to have the relational-based acquisition of language, which is required for a young child to make the association between the sound and the meaning. So you can say the word dog in a vacuum to a baby, and the baby will never understand that there's a connection between that sound and the animal unless you engage the child relationally. You use your ability to engage the child and you say dog, and then you point to something, or dog, and you show them something. And with sufficient repetition in context of this relationship, their brain will weave together the association between that sound and the animal. So neglect can happen as a result of chaotic developmental experiences or absence of certain kinds of neglect of developmental experiences. And one of the populations that we've worked with a lot, and we've learned a lot about neglect, is from children who have had some form of profound sensory deprivation. And some of these children have come from institutional settings, and some of these children have come from very, very extreme situations in the US, for example. Children raised in cages, children raised in closets, children isolated in basements and kept away from other human beings. And what we've learned from these children is that if, particularly in the first 3 years of life, when the brain is so rapidly organizing, if they do not receive sufficient levels of nurturing and cognitive stimulation and motor exploration opportunities, that there can be significant developmental problems that we have to address. And one of the most sobering things that we see is that this level of neglect can be so severe that it will literally manifest as profound abnormalities in how the brain is organized. And if you look at this comparison, for example, of a normal child who's 3 years old with a child who spent the first 3 years of his life in a cage, you can see tremendous difference in the size of the brain. This is an average child. This is not a child who's got a brain that's, too big. This is a brain in the 50th percentile. And this is the brain of a child who was raised in a cage. And you see this big space here, it's called a ventricle. You see a smaller brain, and you see linear definition right here in the cortex area, which is indicative of underdevelopment of the cortex. So these children's brains are profoundly different as a result of these neglectful experiences. When you look at these children using more sophisticated techniques, you can also see significant abnormalities in the way that these neural networks organize. So using both conventional imaging techniques and then what we call functional imaging techniques, you can see abnormalities in children who've had profound early life neglect. And part of what we do with this neurosequential model is, rather than using conventional neuroimaging to create a map of what's working and what's not working, we use a functional map. And we take that upside down triangle model that we've been talking about, and we look at a variety of functions that are mediated by the cortex, and then functions that are mediated by the limbic system, and functions that are mediated by the diencephalon and the brainstem, and we see how well they're organized and whether they're present in these children. And then we can create a map of where the child's strengths are and where their gaps are and where they need work, and it helps us specifically target the kinds of educational and therapeutic activities that will be required to meet the child where they are developmentally and help coax them up the developmental ladder to meet their full potential. You really need a clinician who's got skill and experience with autism to be able to really make a definitive diagnosis. And it's, in all defense of clinicians, it's important that to realize that children who have autistic-like symptoms can look different at different stages in development. And so at one moment in time when you're looking at the child's functioning, it may appear that, yes, they meet all the criterion for autism. And a couple of years later, they won't. They'll have some developmental problems, but it won't be classically autistic in nature. And we see a lot of that. We see the sort of during development children who meet diagnostic criterion for one label. They might look like they clearly have attention deficit and conduct disorder. But a couple of years later, attentional issues are not as prominent as anxiety issues. And then you start to rethink what's going on. And as I mentioned in earlier parts of this series, the diagnostic dilemma of trying to understand the developmental trauma in children leads to these different clinical pictures at different stages in development. And it can be very confusing to people who are doing clinical work. So again, what we try to do whenever we can is make sure that we understand the history of the child very well, make sure we understand the evolution of their strengths and weaknesses, and the evolution of symptom complexes. And usually when we get that information, we can make a pretty good estimate about what systems in the brain appear to be well organized, what systems appear to be present but poorly organized, what systems appear to be, if you will, undeveloped, that they just never had an opportunity to get the repetition required to manifest them, and use all of that information to target the interventions. And you know, we're lucky that we're not compelled to give a diagnostic label in our work, because we don't usually get involved in a third-party payer model. And you know, one of the things that's unfortunate about the medical economic model is that in order to get reimbursement, you have to give a label. So even when a clinician feels that the child might not completely fit this picture, they're still asked by the insurer to give us a definitive diagnostic label. So I think, you know, the difference between where we are in understanding child neuropsychiatric disorders and where we are in labeling them is leading to this frequent disconnect. And I think that it's just, you know, we're really early in the evolution of our field. And I think that in, you know, 30 years, 50 years, we'll have a much more sophisticated model for how we actually give diagnostic labels. Both with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, more classically they present to the clinical systems when people are older. But researchers and clinicians who've been looking at the emergence developmentally of these disorders are sort of backing up earlier and earlier and earlier. And I've actually seen children who were 3 years old who I would say have very, very strong precursor symptoms of a bipolar disorder. And these kids, the reason I said it was that the children would have, you know, 2-week-long periods where they would not sleep. And they were just literally like they were on speed and just, and then they would have these periods where they would crash and they would be lethargic and depressive in their presentation. So now that's very unusual. But the people who do primary research in both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are trying to back up earlier and earlier and earlier to try and identify these problems when they are hopefully most manageable. If you look at depression in adults, if you look at dissociative disorder, anxiety disorder, even if you look at schizophrenia, there's a high, the incidence of adverse childhood experiences is much higher in those populations than it is in populations that don't have those disorders. So what we think is this, is you know, this is sort of a universal conceptualization of many human disorders, and it's called the diathesis stress model, that everybody's born with certain genetic gifts, you know, whether it's, you know, you're going to have a strong heart, or you're going to have a weak bowel, or you're going to have a tendency for mood problems, but that if you have developmental stress that influences these adrenergic and noradrenergic systems, and then the neurons that go out to the organs of your body, like your heart, your lung, and your gut, if you work those systems too hard, it will unmask and accelerate whatever vulnerability you might have. So if you're sort of genetically predisposed to diabetes and you have adverse childhood experiences, you will manifest symptoms of diabetes earlier, and they'll be more severe than if you didn't have that adverse childhood experience. And our group has basically written a paper with a group of colleagues at the Center for Disease Control who've been looking at adverse childhood experiences and the impact they have on adult functioning. And basically what we find, or what they find and what we help interpret, is that your risk for any significant physical health problem, your risk for any significant social problem like alcoholism, substance abuse, divorce, criminality, and your risk for neuropsychiatric disorders is all increased when you have adverse childhood experiences. And the risk for these things is increased in kind of a dose-dependent way. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, and the more prolonged they are, the more likely you are to manifest these problems later in life. And in some cases, it's probably a specific relationship between the impact of trauma on these neural systems that we've been talking about, and in other cases, it's probably an indirect effect. But we have a lot more to learn about that. The unifying principle that you see in all effective therapies is that there has been the creation of a safe relationship. And in the field, we kind of term this the therapeutic relationship. Now, the way you get to that sense of safety can be very different. And the tools, if you will, the window into the brain can be very different. So you can have a cognitive behavioral approach that's focusing a lot on cortical mechanisms, but ultimately we believe that the mutative agent, the agent of change, is the relationship that has been created in context of this cognitive behavioral therapy. So these different therapeutic approaches all have the unifying feature of allowing one human being to create a therapeutic, safe relationship with another human being, and then find some other vehicle to help the person continue to develop or improve or learn more about how they're functioning. What is going on with children today that requires an educator to feel like they have to be an entertainer in order to engage the child and get them to learn in a conventional educational setting? And part of what's being observed by many, many people is that children who grow up in environments where they watch hours and hours and hours of television, particularly the way children's television is shown in this incredibly rapid staccato style, is that the brain is developing in these children in a way that it has these sensory preferences, that the brain, as we've talked about, develops in a use-dependent way. And if a child is in 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day when they're young, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're used to this incredibly sensory-enriched visual stimulation and auditory stimulation that comes from videos and television, as soon as they're put into a quiet classroom setting where they're asked to sit and to listen to one person talk, it actually is very, very, very understimulating. And so these children's brains are seeking this visual input. And there are a number of studies that are emerging that document that children who watch lots of television early in life have a much higher probability of having what we call attention deficit disorders. And we believe that that's because their brain is essentially being organized in a way that it not only prefers, but sort of requires information to be presented in that way in order for them to absorb it. The corollary of the challenge that the educator faces today is, at the same time that they're getting more and more children who have these sensory preferences, they're getting more and more pressure from the administrative systems to teach children cognitive things earlier and earlier. So the expectation now is that a child who comes into first grade should read, and that they should have these fundamental skills that we used to teach actually in the first grade. So there is an acceleration of introduction of cognitive content to children at a time when I believe many of these children are not developmentally prepared to optimally benefit from cognitive instruction. And it's not that you shouldn't teach children to read. In fact, it's a wonderful gift. But if you recall what I said earlier about the importance of how the brain makes associations between things that co-occur in time, the little child who's 2 years old, who's in the arms of grandpa at night when he's reading a bedtime story, begins to make an association with reading and with those symbols on the page and with those sounds, with warmth and with play and with laughter and pleasurable things. So children who are taught to read or introduced to reading in the arms of a loving parent or relative at night or in another context begin to make an association between reading and pleasure. Children who learn to read when they're 3, 4, and 5 and they're at a preschool or a kindergarten setting, when they're being forced to sit down and listen to me, repeat after me, A, B, C, they don't make an association between a pleasurable experience and reading. In fact, they hate reading. And one of the sad things that's been happening with American children is that the percentage of children who choose to read for pleasure has been plummeting. And in comparison to 20 years ago, the number of high school seniors who read for pleasure has gone from 40 all the way down to about 7%, which is very, very disturbing. One of the really disturbing aspects of this new child-rearing environment that's multimedia and cognitively focused is that children are growing up in a world where there's always sound and where there's always visual stimuli. So they're literally uncomfortable when they're put in situations where they would normally have opportunities for solitude, meditation, prayer, quiet reflective time, which we know is very, very important for processing information and for consolidating previously learned information and crucial for creativity. But most children are now growing up where they don't feel comfortable in an environment where there's not some kind of external stimulus. And I think that that's very, very tragic because, as I said earlier, in order for us to be our most creative, to be our most thoughtful, we really need to have long periods of time where we have no external complexity in the world and we have no internal distress. We need more meditative time. We need more reflective time. And our culture is broadly disrespectful of that. We've taken away recess. We've taken away spontaneous play for children. We've overscheduled and overstructured our children. We have this unfortunate pressure that's well-intended but biologically and developmentally uninformed to get these kids this cognitive stuff crammed into their brains. And it's really all misguided. The question about how our current psychometric and evaluation and assessment methods fit with children who have trauma and or developmental problems is really important. What we're finding is that if you use conventional psychometrics, that you really don't capture very often really important developmental gaps or developmental issues. And that in order to kind of create a full functional map, you really need this array of existing psychometrics and psychological tests, usually which are not provided in a conventional psychological assessment. So you may send a child off for an evaluation and they may have early life neglect and they may have a certain area of cognitive strength and a certain area of cognitive deficit. They may have relational difficulties, but the instruments that you use won't capture that. And one of the reasons that we've been using this neurosequential map is that we're able to take history, We're able to take simple questions about functioning that can be answered by the parent and or the teacher, and we're able to take existing psychometrics and psychological tests and create a very good estimate of the presence of certain brain-mediated functions and how well they're organized or whether they're dysfunctional or not. And the way we do that is that we have a multidisciplinary staffing. We will take one of our neurosequential maps and with all of the blank spaces related to all of the different functions that we're interested in, and then we will go through a little bit of a presentation about the child's current functioning. We'll get a little bit of history about their early developmental experiences in functioning. We will have had an opportunity to review the existing testing that's been done before, and then we can make, as I said, very good estimates of whether or not certain functions are present or not. And if you take a typical psychometric measure, like the CBCL, for example, some of the responses on the CBCL tell you about the cortex. And some of the responses on the CBCL that might have to do with how you get along with friends and how you make relationships tell you a little bit about limbic functions. And some of the questions will tell you about brainstem functioning. But collectively, with people who know the child, with people who know the history of the child, with existing psychometrics, with grades, with input from all these people that know the child, you can really create a very practical and useful estimate of how the child's neurodevelopment has gone to date. The question that frequently is asked by clinicians is, you know, I've sat through this, I've learned this, I've read about this, and it makes sense. But it is something that sometimes will require me to recommend to parents and to teachers interventions and or therapeutic activities that might seem a little bit odd or very different from what they're used to. And that's absolutely true. When you talk to a teacher and you say, you know, this child who gets out of control in your class, we want you to basically, when they start to act this way, just walk away. They're like, are you crazy? They need to be controlled. We need to get on top of them. Why you know, they can't act out like this. And so the challenge that we have when we do our work is that in the process of creating the therapeutic web for the child. And by therapeutic web, I mean that collective group of people who are going to interact with that child in positive ways that have the ability to heal and to educate and to help the child develop more normally. And that means teachers and coaches and grandparents and people living in the home and sometimes even older siblings. The challenge of putting that together falls into our hands in large part. And a huge part of our clinical work is educating people in this system about these issues. And it really is not as hard as it might seem. A tremendous aid in that process, believe it or not, has been these little maps. When we tried to use just words and persuasion and cognitive things that were just coming in orally about why we should do these things, many people got it and they sort of understood it. But when we started to show them pictures that, listen, this is the functional map of a normal 8-year-old child, and this is the functional map of the foster child that's living in your home, they immediately go, oh wow, that's not the same as this. And then when we do just a tiny little bit of education, they understand that even though this child is 8, I really need to parent this child around social issues and social relatedness as if he was only 3. And he does have some cognitive strengths. I can have the expectation that he can learn cognitive things in the area of mathematics just like a regular 8-year-old. But he's a little bit behind in reading, so he's reading like a 6-year-old. And as long as you can help them see, all right, well, let's look at where this child is developmentally in all these different domains, a light bulb goes off in their heads, and it explains a lot of what they've observed, and it helps them feel much better about the progress that they make. The other issue that's very, very important in this work, and this is harder, is that very often we end up doing a neurosequential map of the caregiver. So not all the kids that we work with are in the child protective system. A lot of these kids who have been maltreated and traumatized are still living with the family and the parent who either neglected or was incapable of caring for the child at some point. And what we find is we'll have 20, 25, 26-year-old parents who have the neurodevelopmental capabilities of a much younger person. So part of what we do with these parents is try to help them find a set of activities that they can do either with the child or they can do by themselves that will begin to repair some of their own developmental trauma, some of their own issues, and ultimately make it easier for them to be a healthy parent for their child. Another major question when you're using this therapeutic approach is, what of these multiple activities do you choose? How long do we have to do it? And should we only do one thing at a time, or should we do two things at a time? And the answer to that is a little bit evasive, but it's simpler than it sounds. The goal of this therapeutic approach is to recognize that at some point you will want to do a lot of different things. But the key is to pick the thing currently, the set of activities currently that will provide pattern, repetitive, reparative experiences for the lowest part of the brain. So a child may have terrible self-esteem, which is kind of a cognitively, cortically mediated issue. And you may want to improve the child's self-esteem. But if they have this state regulation problem, this self-control problem, this impulsivity problem, no matter how much you address your self-esteem building activities to the child, that will be ineffective. So that's why we call this the neurosequential model, that at some point we're going to get there, but let's do it when the child's ready to benefit from these interventions. So the key is this: pick patterned, repetitive, relational, rhythmic activities in the beginning to ensure that the self-regulating systems in the brain are going to be as well organized as possible and as responsive as possible to healthy interactions. And that once you have that base, once you have that solid self-regulating capability, then you can add on additional, more complex motor, social, and cognitive activities. The question is, what's the difference between the pattern, repetitive, reparative experiences you provide for a 2-year-old in comparison to a 7-year-old in comparison to a 17-year-old? And that's the challenge, is that each of those children is living in some context where they will have a certain set of expectations in the world about what's age appropriate, about how children that age should act. And so if you're 2 years old and you need pattern, repetitive, somatosensory experiences to help reorganize this brainstem, crawling into somebody's lap and being rocked for 20 minutes is okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's not that far away from what might be a normal activity for a 2-year-old child. Participating in a very simple music and movement thing where you sort of tap on a stick in rhythm with the music that you're hearing, that's not that, a 2-year-old can do that kind of thing. A 7-year-old can kind of do that thing too. It's harder for the 7-year-old to crawl into the lap of a teacher and get rocked for 20 minutes. However, there are tactile somatosensory activities that can be taught to the foster parent or to the parent using the input from a massage therapist, for example, where you can develop age-appropriate, patterned, repetitive somatosensory activities that you could do 3 times a day. You know, we have children we worked with, for example, who were 7, who really would have loved to have been rocked, but what we allowed them to do was swing. They went to the playground and the teachers couldn't get them off the swing, and when they pulled the kids off the swing, they would put them in the classroom and expect them to cognitively learn. The kids would act out and disrupt, and they wanted to extrude these kids from the classroom. So ultimately we finally said, all right, let the kids swing. So at the beginning of the year, he would swing for 3 hours a day. And in the middle of the year, he was only swinging for an hour and a half a day. By the end of the year, he was swinging for 20 minutes. And every time he controlled basically when he was swinging and how much he needed. So swinging, massage therapy, certain kinds of music and movement are age appropriate at 7. You get to 17, it's a little bit harder, but you can do it. Again, you can use therapeutic massage. Yeah, you know, sometimes it's a little bit harder to get a 17-year-old to sort of buy into that, but typically if you have a good therapeutic massage clinician, they can form enough of an alliance where it feels okay, and that will be a useful component of that intervention. The use of music by 17-year-olds will be also very, very powerful. We see, for example, 17-year-olds who have this state regulation problem, who are in the juvenile justice system or actually in the child protective system. They'll put on their earphones and turn on their iPod whenever they want to soothe, and you see them moving, and the rhythms that they're moving in are 80 beats per minute. So they will use music to self-soothe. The goal of an intervention would be more deliberate about that, to be more consistent about that, and to hopefully get the child into some other kinds of activities where they could get more patterned, repetitive activities. So for example, there's a group up in Alberta who uses drumming and learning traditional First Nations dancing as a means to engage and to provide patterned, repetitive brainstem stimulation for adolescents who are Native American who have those self-regulation problems. And the outcomes of kids that get into that program are far superior to the outcomes of children who don't have that benefit. So again, you have to be a little bit creative. You have to think about how you can provide a set of activities and enrichment, whether they're therapeutic or educational enrichment, that have these qualities, but don't humiliate the child. They're not particularly degrading. I mean, one of the things that's important is that I've been talking a lot about somatosensory input and how that's important. And there are some therapeutic approaches where unfortunately, people use somatosensory activity like holding or restraining children against their will. And based upon everything you've been learning in this series, you would know that is not going to be successful, because if it's against their will, it's going to be activating their arousal response, and they feel distressed and disturbed and sometimes even traumatized by being forced to be embraced and rocked and things that are not what they choose to do. So coercive techniques of any sort will never work effectively with traumatized children. And if anything, they'll make them worse. The question of the impact of multiple placements on children is unfortunately really at the heart of our child protective system's failure to create biologically informed and child-sensitive programs and policies. There is nothing more destabilizing, there is nothing more overwhelming, there is nothing more therapeutically disruptive than to force a young, overwhelmed, traumatized child to uproot from their school, from their community, from their friends, and move someplace else. And try to fit in a new place, try to form new relationships, try to do okay at this new school, and then to get moved again. And what it does is it builds into these children a sense of hopelessness. And many of you have maybe read about or know about the phenomenon of learned helplessness, which is that if you are put into a situation where you perceive that you have no control over anything, that you ultimately give up, and then when you are in a situation where you do have control, where your behaviors will impact the world, you don't do them. And this is one of the saddest things about children who are in the child protective system, is that so many of them have given up on the possibility of having a positive relationship with an adult, particularly an adult in authority. Most of them have given up on themselves. And they'll say, I'm too stupid to do well in school. Why should I try? I'm going to get moved in 3 months, so even though I'm a great athlete, why should I go out for sports? They give up on themselves, and they give up on opportunities to get better. And that's one of the saddest things that happens in this work. What you can do with these children is give them a sense of hope. When you are engaged with a child who's in the system, or any child, if you are present and if you are honest and if you are respectful, you have an opportunity to create for them a different version of what their personal catalog of experience with adults has been. And even though we've been talking about how important it is to have repetition to change the brain, one of the great qualities of the human brain is the capacity to create memory. So you can have one event where somebody was respectful to you, who listened to you, who was kind and nurturing to you, and you can store that. You can make a memory of that, and it will be a source of hope for you. If these children feel hopeful that somewhere out there, someplace, there has to be another adult who can interact with me like that, or I could grow up to be a person like this doctor, like this caseworker, like this teacher, you will be giving this child something that's fundamentally valuable and ultimately transforming, even though you may never ever have any idea about the impact you had on this child. And it is the capacity to create the internal expectation that the world can be different that creates hope. And if you are honest with these kids, if you are respectful, if you treat them with dignity, it will be fundamentally different than the way they've been treated by most adults in their life. And it will be a transforming experience. One of the biggest questions in our field is whether or not humans have what are called critical windows. In the field of developmental neuroscience, a critical window is a time period during development during which a certain set of experience has to be present if the function is going to emerge. There's a related phenomenon called sensitive windows, which are sensitive periods during which the brain is more sensitive to input than other times. And we know that human beings have sensitive periods for all kinds of things. But it's not clear yet whether or not we have these absolutely critical windows. And the human brain is quite malleable. One of the great gifts about the human brain is that there's this incredible plasticity. It's different from any other species. Our brain has the capacity to make more changes and to process more information more efficiently than any other species. And we believe that this plasticity and this malleability is a reason to be hopeful about children who've not had what they need early in life. Now, with that said, we believe that children who have early life neglect, as they get older, and as this gap between their chronological age and their developmental age widens, we believe that most children get into caregiving and educational and therapeutic situations where the gap isn't recognized. So the world still expects them to act like they're 8. So the world will provide them with pattern repetitive experiences that would be appropriate for an 8-year-old, but not appropriate for somebody who's developmentally 3. So what happens is, even though it's neurobiologically not necessarily the case that missing these early experiences will cause long-time, lifelong problems, we believe that the way the systems are currently structured and the developmental insensitivity of most of our structures leads to the inevitable outcome that the longer children are neglected early in life, the more likely they are to have lifelong problems in emotional, behavioral, and cognitive domains. And unfortunately, all the research data supports that the longer children who are in institutional settings, the longer they're there before they're adopted, the higher the probability is that they'll have problems later in life. And the longer a child is in a neglectful environment, the more severe their speech and language problems are, the more severe their cognitive problems are, the more severe their emotional problems are as they are tracked later on in life. The question is from a parent who has a child who was raised in an institutional setting for the first 1 year of life, but it was a particularly depriving situation. They adopted the child and they have been trying to sort of help her grow up ever since, and they've been struggling. One of the things that they see is that this child appears to be continually in this state of hypervigilance and is very easily triggered into behaviors that are labeled kind of tantrum-like, but they're essentially these overwhelming situations where the child's way, 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 way out in this hyperarousal state and just overwhelmed and just dissolves, deteriorates. This child also uses frequently dissociative responses where she blanks out and she appears to not be present, and it scares the parents because, number one, they don't really know what this is, and number two, they don't know what to do. So the question really is there anything that we can do to make these episodes stop? And the answer is yes, but it will take a long time. Now, there are two phenomenon that we should talk about that inform this response. And the brain when you've got a connection between one neuron and the next, and there's a certain pattern of signal coming, and you've got this existing, if you will, functional network, what can happen is if you get a certain signal, if the signal that you get from one of these neurons is so consistent and so repetitive and so non-threatening, basically, what happens is the synaptic connection will change, and it will become less responsive. So once, we've talked about this before in terms of when you create a memory template, the first time you hear background noise of ventilation as a baby, you look around and you're trying to figure out where's that sound coming from. And when you see babies having these looks where they're like looking around, they're literally trying to figure out what are these ambient sounds that everybody else seems to pay no attention to, but I hear this droning sound. Where is it coming from? And it'll happen again and again and again and again, and ultimately the baby will learn and the brain will learn that that sound is safe, it's pervasive, it's neutral, and it happens in a lot of different contexts, and you don't need to worry about it. So the baby will walk into or be brought into a new setting, or a child will walk into a new setting, and somebody will turn on the heat, and all of a sudden the background fan of the heater will come on, and the child won't even be aware of it. Now the brain will hear it, but the brain says that's a familiar, repetitive, neural signal, and it habituates. Now this is important because later on we're going to talk about how to use that to help this child get rid of dissociation. The opposite of that is when there is a pattern of neural activity that happens episodically but in big doses. So all of a sudden there's this really big signal, and it causes your system to activate, and then it goes away. And then it happens again, and then it goes away. But it's not continuous and low. In the area of substance abuse, this happens with people who use cocaine continuously during the day after day, week after week. What happens is they become what we call tolerant. Their system habituates. People who use cocaine episodically, they'll go on a binge, and then they won't have cocaine for a week, and then they'll go on a binge, and then they won't have cocaine for a week. And the third time they binge, they'll have a seizure, because the system, instead of getting less responsive, becomes more sensitized. And that's what happens with the stress response system in children who develop trauma-related symptoms. Because the traumatic experience was so intense and chaotically episodic, they sensitized their stress response system. And this little girl has a sensitized dissociative system. So now what you need to do is, instead of providing a stressor that is episodic and overwhelming, which would reinforce the habituation and induce her, would reinforce the sensitization and basically cause her to dissociate even when there's a minor little stressor, is you have to find the tiniest little activity that will make her leave her comfort zone. The tiniest little shift. I mean, it's not a huge thing, it's not a big challenge, but it's something novel enough to actually activate her stress response system, just a tiny bit, before she actually dissociates. But then you have to do it continuously, repetitively, low level, chronic, low level, chronic, low level, chronic, low level, chronic. And what will happen is that system will get little by little by little less sensitive. Now, the way we recommend doing this with a parent like this is, every time you take a child like this from her home out in the world, that's a huge thing. So we recommend, don't take her out. Keep her at home. And the way you introduce novelty to this child that's controllable and continuous is that every day that she's at home, you make sure that there is some activity that she's trying to develop, some, whether it's motor or cognitive or social, that's a tiny little bit out of her comfort zone. She's in a safe and familiar environment at home. You are a safe and familiar person, but you're the safe and familiar person asking her to practice, eye contact, or asking her to practice with me right now how you say and pronounce properly this word. And if you do this day after day after day after day, what will happen is she will slowly be able to tolerate more challenge. And her sensitized system will become habituated. But you need patience, and you need to start from a climate of safety. After people learn about the neurobiological preference that we have as a species to be in these heterogeneous groups where the ratio of developmentally more mature person to young developing child is 4-to-1, I always get the question, well, that's ridiculous for a school. How can you have 4 teachers for every pupil in the classroom? That's a very legitimate comment. It also is an issue in an early child care setting. It's an issue in even a 2-parent home. The ratio that we have in a 2-parent home, even when both parents are home, if you've got multiple children, you've got 2-to-3 or 2-to-4. That's very far off from the 4-to-1 that we're designed for. The comment I have about this that I think is important to think about is that when we are trying to create environments where there are healthier relational opportunities, where there's more variety in the relational opportunities, where there are more healthy individuals around the life of the child that they can learn from, we need to remember that not every healthy relational interaction has to come from a teacher. If you're in an educational setting and you're in the 3rd grade, there's also 4th graders and 5th graders, and in your school district there are going to be middle school kids and high school kids. One of the things that we have done, again, well-intended, but unfortunately it's been destructive, I think, is that we've taken all of our 1st graders and we put them in one class. And then we take all of our 2nd graders and all of our 3rd graders. And rather than having a developmentally heterogeneous environment where there would be these ratios of developmentally mature to developmentally immature that would be more biologically respectful, we have created these settings where there's 1-to-30. And that's impossible for the frontline provider of care. It's impossible for the educator. And it really is less than ideal for the child. So we're very, very strong proponents of very easy, very inexpensive program elements that can shift those ratios. Number one, every community's got a very active group of retirees who have wisdom and experience and time. And if you can engage them and take advantage of their spirit of volunteerism, you can get them into your classroom settings and into the lives of your children in ways that will be a benefit both to the retiree and to the child. The second thing that we need to do is think much more carefully about developmental clustering. Why would we put all these children who are at the same developmental stage in the same classroom for 7 hours a day with one adult? That just doesn't make sense. Why don't we take a high school junior who is learning some advanced topic in biology and have as part of their job to spend some time with a middle school child and an elementary school child in a learning group where there's an older, a middle, and a younger child, and they can actually have a multiply beneficial set of interactions, both cognitive and social, that will help them all. There's no better way to figure out some topic than to have the responsibility of teaching it. In settings where they've set up things like reading buddies, where the 5th graders have a reading buddy in the 1st grade, these are wildly successful programs. In settings where they have high school seniors whose job it is to go into elementary school classrooms and teach and mentor, these are wildly successful situations. So anything that we can do to increase the number and quality of healthy adults or healthy older children in the lives of our young children will be positive. Now, the other thing that's important to remember is that there are certain ratios that are optimal, and there are certain ratios that are acceptable, and then there are certain times when the ratio is absolutely essential for success. And fortunately, most healthy children can tolerate a less than ideal ratio of developmentally mature person to child. A child who's been maltreated and traumatized, however, can't. These children, if they do not get the level of relational attention they require, they will disrupt the classroom. They will act out. They will do things that will not only interfere with their ability to learn, but it will interfere with the ability of all the other kids in the classroom to learn. So we really need to be more creative and more flexible in the way we create childcare, educational, and therapeutic environments for children. And again, every single program that works, when people track what works with at-risk children, what we find is this. Every single program, a home visitation model, a mentoring program, a doula model, a enriched preschool model, every single one of them have the one common unifying element, and that is that they increase the number and quality of relationships in the lives of children or in the lives of people who care for children. Which brings us to this core issue. All of our frontline providers, our early child care providers, our educators, our law enforcement officers, our mental health providers, our probation officers, all of these people are themselves working in relationally impoverished settings. They are asked to do the impossible. When you are supposed to be rewarding and educating and disciplining and structuring children, doing it one-on-one is hard enough. Doing it one-on-one for 7 hours a day with one kid would be tough. But we're asking them to do it one-on-one with 10, 20, 30 kids at a time. It's crazy. So we are setting up our frontline providers to fail. And again, this is because we have set up well-intended but biologically and developmentally ill-informed programs. And ultimately, if we do not take advantage of how our biology works, if we do not appreciate and respect the principles of development, we will never be able to create child and family friendly environments that will help our children meet their potential. A common question that we get about children who have been traumatized is from a teacher or a foster parent concerned about touch. And one of the, I think, unfortunate consequences of, again, well-intended but developmentally uninformed policy changes related to sexual abuse of children is that early child care providers have been instructed in many settings to not touch young children. Now, the policy around this emerged from accusations of sexual abuse that were made by child care providers in a variety of settings. So for liability purposes, there are very large child care settings in the U.S. that provide hours and hours and hours of care for young children where the educators are told, don't touch the children, which is astounding. How can you take a 3 and 4 and 5-year-old child over the course of a day and not touch them? It's completely inappropriate and it's unhealthy for the children. Our children are growing up touch-starved as it is. Not enough grandparents, there's not enough neighbors, there's not enough affection within most families. Our children are starving for touch. And to deprive young children in a child care setting of an affectionate hug or a kind tap on the shoulder because you don't want to get accused of sexual abuse is just foolishness. Now, there are other people who will say, well, listen, what if the child is a victim of sexual abuse? And isn't touch going to be a cue for them and get them all upset? And oh my gosh, we cannot touch kids who've been sexually abused because we're going to re-traumatize them. And here's what I have to say. The problem with kids that have been sexually abused is that they've made an association between touch and a bunch of bad stuff. Now, the only way to make that different for these kids is to give them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to make an association between touch and healthy things. So that will never happen. You'll never get the opportunity to reweave those false associations and correct them unless you have opportunities to have healthy touch. Which means that if anything, sexually abused children need patterned, repetitive, healthy touch even more than children who haven't been sexually abused.